Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show engineered to give you the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed.
Today, we are turning our analytical focus onto a company that operates less like a corporation and more like a massive global sovereign entity, Apple.
That's a great way to put it. Apple is consistently one of the world's most valuable companies, but that massive scale means they don't just sell phones.
Not at all. They constantly operate across this constellation of incredibly complex legal, ethical, and financial battlegrounds.
Right. And the sources we've gathered for this deep dive, they really map out a company that's almost under siege.
It is, fighting governments, regulators, activists all over the globe, often at the same time.
That's really the core insight here, isn't it? When a company gets to this level of dominance, every single decision, from tax payments to the types of screws they use, it becomes a geopolitical issue.
It does. So our mission today is to unpack four major areas of contention. And these really challenge the very foundation of Apple's whole walled garden business model.
Okay, so what are we looking at?
Well, we're talking about massive issues. First, a staggering multi-billion-dollar fight over global taxation. Then there are the intense antitrust battles over the App Store.
The walled garden itself.
Exactly. Then the grassroots fight for the right to repair their physical devices. And finally, the really complex human rights and censorship tightrope they walk across their supply chain.
The numbers alone are just. They set the stakes. We're starting our journey in Europe with a fight over a mind-boggling 13 billion euros in back taxes.
13 billion with a B.
This isn't just accounting, it's challenging how global tech giants even work. So let's jump right into that financial deep end. So the core conflict kicks off with a ruling by the European Commission way back in 2016. That led to this colossal demand for 13 billion euros.
Right.
For our listener, what was the central accusation here? What did Apple and Ireland supposedly do to trigger this monumental penalty?
Well, to put it simply, the European Commission concluded that Ireland had essentially granted Apple illegal state aid.
Illegal state aid.
The argument was that these preferential tax arrangements negotiated between the Irish government and Apple, they stretched from 1991.
Wow, 1991.
All the way up to 2014. And the result was that Apple achieved this extremely low effective corporate tax rate on billions of euros in profits that were technically booked in Europe.
Oh, when you say low, it wasn't just low. For a time, it was close to zero, wasn't it?
Precisely. The rates dropped to fractions of a percentage point on huge profits.
Unbelievable.
So the mandate that came down was just unprecedented. Apple was ordered to repay 13 billion euros in unpaid taxes, plus interest. It's one of the largest corporate tax disputes in history.
And I imagine they didn't just write a check.
Of course not. Both Apple and Ireland immediately pushed back. They claimed the arrangements were totally compliant with Irish law, that they didn't breach any EU competition rules.
Yeah, we're just paying what they legally owed under the system as it was.
That was their argument. But to understand how such a vast sum could go untaxed, you really have to look at the mechanism of profit shifting.
Right. And it involves these two specific Irish incorporated subsidiaries. Tell us about them.
Apple Operations Europe, or AOE, and Apple Sales International, ASI. These two entities were the central engine for this whole thing.
So the disputed profits, they were generated from licensing intellectual property.
This is the core value of Apple's technology.
Yeah, and those profits were formally booked through these Irish entities.
Exactly.
But this is where the paper trail really seems to diverge from reality. Where were the people, the activities that actually generated the value for that IP?
Almost entirely in the United States, specifically in Cupertino.
So the engineers, the designers.
All of them. The decision-making, the design, the engineering, the brains that created the value of the iPhone, that was all done by Apple Inc., employees in the U.S.
Not the staff in Ireland?
The staff in Ireland were handling routine distribution, assembly. The sources are very clear. Many of the directors of these so-called Irish subsidiaries actually worked and lived in Cupertino.
So you have profits booked in Ireland, but the actual economic activity is in the U.S.
You got it. And that's the magic trick of the old international tax system, getting income classified in a way that neither place really claims it.
So how did they achieve that tax limbo?
Well, under the U.S. tax rules at the time, this is pre-2018, profits held offshore often weren't taxed in the U.S. until they were formally brought back home.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the Irish tax authorities didn't treat them as taxable either. And the reason was they argued the profits weren't generated by the functions of the actual Irish branches.
So where were they generated?
They were attributed to the head offices of these subsidiaries, which were, for all intents and purposes, declared stateless for tax purposes. They were shell companies.
So these massive profits were just floating in a void, anchored only by these Irish subsidiaries, and not being taxed anywhere.
In a nutshell, yes. And that gets us right to the legal fight. The European Court of Justice, the ECJ, ultimately sided with the Commission's interpretation.
What was their legal lever? How did they justify it?
The ECJ's view was very, very rigid. They insisted that the profits had to be allocated only by looking at the activity within each defined legal entity.
Meaning just the Irish head office and the Irish branches.
Right. They functionally disregarded all the global activity in Cupertino that actually created the IP value in the first place.
That seems completely counterintuitive for how a global tech company actually works.
It is. But under this really rigid approach, because the Irish head offices had almost no physical presence or activity, the profits were basically attributed by default to the Irish branches.
The branches that handled distribution?
Right. And if the profits were in the branches, the ECJ said they should have been taxed in Ireland.
Okay, and this is where the sources highlight a really core technical critique. It's not just about Apple losing. It's about whether the court was fundamentally misusing established tax principles.
This is where it gets fascinating for anyone who follows international law. Critics argue the ECJ's use of the arm's length principle, or AOA.
That's the idea that related companies should transact as if they were independent.
Right, exactly. It's a foundational principle. The problem is, critics say the ECJ's interpretation was highly questionable. The main difficulty is the timing.
The timing.
The specific AOA standard the ECJ relied on was introduced decades after the first disputed ruling from 1991.
So they were using a rule that didn't exist when the agreement was made to retroactively justify the penalty.
Precisely. Some experts have called it a colossal failure to comply with the principle, and it raises these serious constitutional questions, about how the ECJ's decision squared with its own previous rulings.
It sounds like they were walking a very fine political line.
Absolutely.
And speaking of politics, despite this massive 13 billion euro windfall, Ireland actively fought against getting the money. That says a lot about their national economic strategy.
It says everything. Ireland never wanted to recover that money. Their core fear was that the ruling would just destroy their reputation as a favorable place for multinational investment.
Their whole economy is built on that.
It's built on foreign direct investment, FDI, and the jobs that come with it. A massive state aid recovery order basically tells the world that their tax deals aren't reliable. It undermines their entire economic model.
The sources mention Apple was a pioneer in using these loopholes, specifically the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich.
Ah, the infamous one.
It sounds delicious, but how did this scheme actually work?
It was the pinnacle of what they call base erosion and profit shifting, or BEPS. Essentially, you'd route your IP profits through one Irish company,
Okay.
then move those profits untaxed to a Dutch company, thanks to an EU directive on royalties, and then finally route them to a second Irish company that was tax resident in a tax haven, like the Cayman Islands.
So the money just passed through and vanished, tax-wise.
Exactly. It avoided taxes in all three places. It was ingenious, but politically toxic once it came to light. Ireland eventually had to agree to close it down.
And the aftermath of closing that scheme gave us one of the best terms in modern economics: leprechaun economics. Explain what happened when Apple restructured.
Right. So when Apple had to finally close that old structure, they had to do something with the hundreds of billions of dollars of IP they held offshore.
So they brought it home.
They formally onshored it to Ireland, nearly 300 billion US dollars worth. Because IP is classified as a national asset, this one single accounting move caused Ireland's GDP to be restated upwards by a stunning 26.3%. Later, it was even revised to 34.4%.
It's just a purely statistical event. It's a ghost economy.
That's why Paul Krugman coined the term leprechaun economics. The figures were so grossly distorted by paper transactions that they just stopped reflecting the actual underlying economic reality of the country.
Which has to mess with their domestic policy.
Hugely. It makes their debt-to-GDP ratio look artificially low, potentially misinforming policymakers. It's a real problem.
So after the double Irish was closed, Apple just adopted a new avoidance mechanism, the CAIA arrangement. What did that involve?
The CAIA, or Capital Allowances for Intangible Assets, was the replacement. Instead of funneling profits out, they kept the IP onshore in Ireland. But then they used massive capital allowances, basically tax deductions for the value of that IP, to effectively zero out their future corporate tax bills on non-US revenues in Ireland.
So the location changed, the structure changed, but the goal of avoidance remained exactly the same.
At the end of the day, yes.
And if we look at the bigger picture, this whole saga, it really does align with the global movement towards tax transparency, like the OECD's BEPS project.
It's a key alignment. The EU ruling strongly supports the intentions of the OECD's project, which is trying to update global tax rules for the digital age.
And the two main pillars of BEPS are key here.
Absolutely. Pillar 1, which tries to reallocate taxing rights to where customers actually are, and Pillar 2, which mandates a global minimum corporate tax of 15%.
But there's a massive roadblock to getting this done globally, and that roadblock is the United States itself.
Yes. While the EU is pressing forward, the US has yet to sign up for either BEPS pillar. And while President Biden has expressed support, the political reality is that passing the necessary legislation is highly unlikely in the near term.
Which means this kind of structural avoidance isn't going away anytime soon.
No. It'll remain a viable concern for years to come.
Okay, so let's transition from those international tax courtrooms to the antitrust battlegrounds. The second major front for Apple is its tightly controlled walled garden, the iPhone and the App Store.
And this control structure is now facing, well, existential challenges, most recently from the U.S. Department of Justice.
This is a landmark moment.
It really is. The DOJ, along with 16 state attorneys general, filed a civil antitrust lawsuit back in March 2024. They're accusing Apple of violating the Sherman Act by monopolizing the smartphone market.
And their argument is that Apple doesn't maintain its huge market share through just being better.
No, they argue it's through a deliberate, sustained strategy of exclusion.
The complaint uses this very vivid phrase, whack-a-mole tactics. What does that mean in the context of the App Store?
The whack-a-mole analogy is perfect. It suggests that every time an innovative developer creates something that genuinely threatens Apple's lock-in.
Something that makes it easier to switch platforms.
Exactly. Apple uses contractual restrictions or withholds access to APIs to just stamp it out. It's a perpetual, active suppression of competition to protect their ecosystem and, crucially, their hardware sales.
Let's break down the specific examples of this because they really show how deep this control goes. First, the blocking of super apps.
Right. Super apps like WeChat in Asia, they integrate a ton of services, messaging, payments, commerce into one app.
The idea being you never have to leave it.
Exactly. If a super app was truly cross-platform on both iPhone and Android, it would shatter the incentive to stay locked into iOS just for the apps.
So Apple restricts them.
By restricting their deep integration, Apple protects its status as the only real gateway to digital life on the iPhone.
Okay, next up. Suppressing mobile cloud streaming services. This is a huge one for gaming.
A huge one. Cloud streaming services, like Xbox Cloud Gaming, they render games on a server and stream the video to your phone.
This fundamentally disconnects the app from the hardware.
Right. If you could play the latest, most demanding games perfectly on a 3-year-old iPhone, it really diminishes the pressure to constantly upgrade to the newest, most expensive hardware.
So Apple's policies force these services into, what, clunky browser versions?
Exactly. Awkward, restrictive experiences. It preserves that hardware upgrade cycle.
And then there's maybe the most famous cultural example of this lock-in.
Yeah.
The green versus blue bubble debate.
A classic. The DOJ alleges that Apple deliberately makes the cross-platform messaging experience when an iPhone texts an Android worse.
It's not a technical limitation.
No, it's a strategic choice. They limit features, they degrade security, and they make the green bubble aesthetic feel inferior. The complaint argues this puts huge social pressure on users, especially younger ones, to make sure their whole social circle uses iPhones.
What about other areas, like accessories, smartwatches, and digital wallets?
Same story. If you buy a non-Apple smartwatch, its functionality is noticeably diminished when you pair it with an iPhone.
So if you switch away from an iPhone,
You face substantial out-of-pocket costs to replace your watch, your headphones, everything. It makes switching less likely.
and with digital wallets.
For a long time, Apple prevented third-party apps from getting full access to the NFC chip needed for Tap to Pay.
So you had to use Apple Pay.
It restricted that essential function exclusively to their own platform, shutting out competing financial services.
In this U.S. lawsuit, it's not happening in a vacuum. It follows massive regulatory action in Europe.
That's right, specifically the EU's music streaming fines. That 1.84 billion euro fine in March 2024 was monumental.
And this wasn't about the tech itself?
No, it was about Apple abusing its dominant market position. The core of it was these anti-steering provisions.
Which means
They prevented developers like Spotify from even telling users inside the app that they could subscribe more cheaply on the web, bypassing Apple's 30% commission.
and that EU ruling directly led to this new high-stakes French class action lawsuit. What's the challenge there?
This lawsuit is taking it a step further. It challenges Apple's entire services revenue model, that 30% commission.
The plaintiffs are arguing that the anti-steering rules cause direct economic harm to users.
Precisely. They're saying users were forced to pay higher in-app prices that baked in the cost of Apple's commission, and that restricting information about cheaper options violates consumer rights.
So it's not just developers fighting Apple now, it's consumers fighting back over the cost.
That's the huge shift. Apple's defense is always that these restrictions are necessary for security and fraud prevention.
But the question being asked globally is whether that justification is worth the anti-competitive effect.
And the economic harm to everyone else. The pressure is already forcing Apple to change, starting in Europe under the Digital Markets Act.
So they're already allowing things like direct subscriptions.
Yes, and letting apps tell users about cheaper options. If this French lawsuit is successful, it could put billions of dollars of revenue at risk and fundamentally reshape the App Store worldwide.
So this battle for control, it's not just digital. It extends right into the physical product itself. Our third front is the long-running fight over the right to repair.
And this saw a really significant, though very complicated, shift in 2023. Apple, surprisingly, endorsed the California Right to Repair bill.
That must have been a political earthquake.
It was. For years, Apple was the most aggressive lobbyist against right to repair legislation. They always argued that providing parts and documentation risked security and their IP.
So to suddenly endorse the California bill, which mandates all of that,
It surprised everyone. It's a perfect example of the California effect, where one huge state market basically dictates national behavior for a company.
but advocates immediately met this with skepticism. They suspected a bait and switch. What's driving that mistrust?
Well, the fear is that Apple will comply with the absolute bare minimum of the law, while still using other means to slow down the momentum for stronger laws elsewhere.
And the key is in the details, like the definition of parts.
Exactly. Independent technicians are asking, will Apple provide individual components, like a single tiny chip, or will they only offer huge, expensive, bundled replacements?
Forcing you to buy a whole motherboard for $700 when only a tiny part failed.
Right. It makes a repair cost so high that it's just impractical for most people. It drives you back to authorized Apple repair, or, more likely, just buying a new device.
And that suspicion seems reinforced by Apple's aggressive opposition to banning parts pairing in other states, like Oregon.
Parts pairing is the new battleground. It's a brilliant anti-repair mechanism, really.
So what is it exactly?
It's the practice of digitally serializing components, the screen, the battery, the camera, and then matching those serial numbers to the device's main logic board using software.
And if you install a replacement part that isn't paired by Apple?
The device will often display a warning, lose key functionality like Face ID, or just not work properly.
So what was Apple's defense for this? Why did they fight the Oregon bill trying to ban it?
One of Apple's senior managers testified that parts pairing is essential to ensure the security, safety, and privacy of Oregonians.
So they frame it as a security feature.
The rationale is that it guarantees the component is genuine and not malicious.
But for repair advocates, this is just anti-competitive behavior dressed up as security.
They argue it severely restricts consumer choice and forces everyone into expensive, Apple-authorized channels. And critics point out that Apple sometimes imposes these restrictions on older devices retroactively.
So it's a software lock on a physically functional component.
Exactly. It shows that control is often valued more than the longevity of the device itself.
And this theme of absolute control, it extends all the way to the end-of-life process. We see this recycling paradox, where Apple actually mandates the physical destruction of devices, even if they're still working.
It's so counterintuitive. Apple's contracts with their e-waste partners strictly mandate that devices must be destroyed, put through a massive shredder.
Even if they could be refurbished.
Yes, and this whole process is done under these almost paramilitary levels of secrecy and surveillance. Locked doors, metal detectors, constant cameras.
But why? Why shred perfectly good devices instead of encouraging reuse?
Their rationale is rooted in two things: security and fraud prevention.
Okay.
First, total destruction ensures any chip containing user data is irrevocably destroyed. That protects customer privacy, which is key to their marketing.
And the fraud part.
It prevents high-value components like logic boards or cameras from being harvested and used to produce unauthorized Frankenstein devices on the gray market.
But the environmental cost of that decision has to be massive.
Critics argue it's huge. Forced shredding creates a significantly larger carbon footprint compared to reconditioning and resale. Reuse is low energy. Smelting and recycling is very energy intensive.
It's a difficult ethical choice, component security versus the environment.
And the high value of these used devices, even as scrap, it fuels crime. We saw that in the lawsuit against one of their recyclers, GEP.
What happened there?
Apple sued Jeep Canada for over $22 million. They accused them of breach of contract after an audit found that nearly 100,000 items, including thousands of iPhones, were not destroyed as they were supposed to be.
And where did they end up?
They were reportedly reactivated in China. The company blamed rogue employees, but it just shows the constant security nightmare created by the value in those parts.
So Apple's response to the human security risk was to develop robotic recycling, the Daisy robot. How effective has that been?
Daisy is incredibly impressive. She can handle 15 different iPhone models, process 200 units an hour, breaking them down for material recovery.
Bypassing the human temptation for theft.
Right. The problem is scale. There are only 2 Daisy robots in existence.
Only 2.
And together, they only process about 1.2 million iPhones a year. Apple sells hundreds of millions. 1.2 million is about 2 days' worth of their sales volume. So automation is not a real solution yet.
All right, our final section shifts to the ethical and human rights tightrope that Apple walks. This spans everything from internal pay practices to their global supply chain and government compliance.
And let's start with their internal corporate challenges. The gender pay lawsuit in California.
This sounds like a massive challenge to their centralized corporate structure.
It is. They're facing a potential class action lawsuit over claims of systemic gender pay disparities and a hostile work environment. This is across multiple divisions: engineering, AppleCare, marketing.
And the court is letting it proceed.
Yes, which signals there could be serious structural issues.
So what are the specific policies the lawsuit alleges are causing this disparity?
The allegations center on what the lawsuit calls a start low, stay low wage setting policy. Meaning that even with centralized, supposedly neutral compensation policies, the system relies heavily on things like prior pay and salary expectations.
And since women historically enter the workforce with lower pay, that disparity just gets baked in and perpetuated.
That's the argument. The suit also alleges that performance evaluations disproportionately disadvantage women, and that men are rewarded more generously in talent reviews.
And beyond just the money, the case also brings up serious allegations about a hostile work environment.
That's right. The case has detailed claims from employees who allege the company failed to address sexual harassment complaints for years.
And the company's response was inadequate.
One plaintiff claimed Apple not only failed to provide accommodations, but actually placed the burden on her, the victim, to find a new role inside the company. The judge found the evidence suggested a pattern of inadequate corporate response.
This internal friction is also showing up in their dealings with labor organizing.
Yes. Apple has faced multiple charges from the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, for alleged anti-union stances and stifling worker organizing.
Including firing employees involved in activism.
Yes, an employee involved in the hashtag Apple2 anti-harassment movement. We also know Apple used to require NDAs in exchange for severance pay before corporate pressure forced them to stop. It all points to a culture that really prioritizes secrecy.
Okay, now let's move out of Cupertino and into the global supply chain. Specifically, the labor conditions at suppliers like Foxconn. These issues seem perennial.
They absolutely are. We've seen decades of reports about labor rights violations, suicides, excessive overtime, low wages. Recently, a Foxconn factory in India was placed on probation after a major protest over food poisoning in substandard hostels.
A 2023 investigation by China Labor Watch into the Foxconn Chengdu plant provides some really specific damning details.
The CLW report cited conditions that are truly shocking. For example, forced overtime was rampant. The longest continuous working period they recorded was 14 days straight.
14 days.
With only a single day off. Workplace bullying and this sort of ritualized abuse were used as management tactics, workers being verbally abused for being 10 seconds late.
That level of detail highlights the relentless pressure. What about discrimination claims?
Recruitment discrimination against pregnant female workers was explicitly cited. The factory required a chest X-ray as part of the physical exam.
Which a pregnant woman can't safely take.
Right. So the policy implicitly prevented them from being hired, which is a way to get around laws against direct discrimination.
And sexual harassment.
The report documented widespread harassment on the factory floor and in work-related WeChat groups, with management failing to enforce any meaningful restrictions or punishments.
Did Apple respond to these findings?
They did. They confirmed their audits found that the percentage of temporary workers had exceeded its standards and claimed that issues with excessive overtime had been corrected.
But critics argue these are often just temporary fixes to pass an audit.
Right, rather than systemic changes. It highlights Apple's ultimate responsibility as the client driving that production pace.
Switching gears to the digital sphere, let's talk privacy. This is an area Apple markets itself on so aggressively.
They do. Yet we see settlements that clash with those stated values. The Siri lawsuit is a prime example.
What happened there?
Apple agreed to pay $95 million in 2025 to settle claims related to contractors analyzing Siri recordings.
This is despite Apple always saying that Siri data is not used for marketing or sold.
Exactly. The settlement highlights the tension. Even if the data was anonymized, the fact that humans were listening to potentially confidential recordings, even for quality control, it erodes that consumer trust.
And then there's the issue of government surveillance, where Apple is criticized for cooperating.
Yes. They've faced consistent criticism for complying with certain government requests, particularly handing over data related to push notifications.
So the very thing they say makes the ecosystem secure, their tight control, also makes it a target.
It creates a single, powerful, centralized lever for governments to impose surveillance and control. It's the antithesis of the freedom they market globally.
Which brings us to the most geopolitically charged issue of all, Apple's deep relationship with China and its compliance with their extensive censorship regime. What's the scope of app takedowns we've seen?
The scope is staggering. Apple has removed thousands of apps from the China App Store at the request of the government, always citing compliance with local laws. Just recently, they removed major apps like WhatsApp and Threads.
Why?
The government order reportedly cited problematic mentions of President Xi Jinping, though Apple wouldn't confirm that specific reason.
And what are the types of content that are consistently targeted?
The list is a clear indicator of the state's priorities. Critical tools like VPNs, which are essential to get around the Great Firewall.
Of course.
For news apps like the New York Times, political apps used by Hong Kong protesters, and even lifestyle apps like two popular gay dating apps.
The concern is that this goes beyond just responding to official government orders. There are accusations that Apple engages in proactive censorship.
Analysis strongly suggests this is the case. One investigation identified over 3,000 apps missing from the China App Store that were available elsewhere, and almost a third of them related to politically sensitive human rights topics.
More than illegal content like gambling or porn.
Far more. The investigation found apps about Tibetan Buddhism, Falun Gong, and Islam were routinely blocked, even without a direct public government order.
So the implication is that Apple is policing its own store just to appease Beijing.
That is the core accusation. Critics argue Apple is preemptively blocking these apps to safeguard its essential business relationship with China.
It's their third largest market and the hub of their supply chain.
Indispensable. And former engineers suggest that despite trying to diversify to Vietnam and India, China's dominance in high-tech manufacturing will be a reality for decades. It locks Apple into this difficult political compromise.
So how does Apple defend this? Enabling state censorship while marketing itself as a champion of human rights.
They maintain that their presence in China is the best way to promote fundamental rights. They argue that by staying engaged, they have a voice to push back.
But critics just see them prioritizing profit.
They accuse Apple of enabling China's censorship and surveillance regime because the commercial incentives are just too powerful. It's a painful dilemma. Shareholder value versus stated corporate values.
So this deep dive, it has really mapped out this whole constellation of conflicts that define life for a global empire like Apple.
It really has. We've moved from the high-stakes financial mechanics of that 13 billion euro tax dispute and leprechaun economics
Through the structural threats from the DOJ and EU antitrust lawsuits.
to the granular fights over physical components and the right to repair movement.
And finally, the profound ethical complexity of the Chinese supply chain and their software ecosystem.
And what becomes overwhelmingly clear is that central tension we talked about. Apple's efforts to maximize value and maintain this near absolute control.
They're now directly clashing with global demands for transparency, competition, and accountability.
Every single core aspect of their business model is being challenged, sometimes with astonishing financial consequences.
Let's focus on that central tension for a second.
Hmm.
The paradox of control. Apple justifies its rigid controls, App Store restrictions, parts pairing, the shredding mandate, as necessary for security and privacy.
But that very mechanism of proprietary control is the exact basis for all the major antitrust actions and consumer freedom fights we discussed.
So the serialization of parts prevents a cheap fix, which maintains revenue.
The limitation on NFC access protects their financial service market. The suppression of super apps protects their gateway position.
All justified under the banner of a superior, secure experience.
Yet all interpreted by regulators as anti-competitive behavior that harms the consumer and the broader market. The cost of Apple's security is often the limitation of consumer choice.
It's clear that regulators and activists have found the weak points. They are attacking Apple's control from every conceivable angle.
Tax authorities targeting profit shifting, antitrust regulators targeting the platform gateway, repair advocates targeting the hardware lock-in, human rights groups targeting the supply chain, and censorship.
Which leaves us with a provocative final thought for you to consider.
Apple built its unparalleled success on two pillars: ingenious, proprietary control of the user experience, and a world-leading mastery of international tax avoidance.
Right.
So if global governments and these regulatory movements successfully enforce robust transparency, fair competition, and strict accountability across all four of these battlefronts, tax, labor, antitrust, and repair, will Apple's unique business model, built on that level of tight proprietary control, even be sustainable in the long run?
Or will they be forced to fundamentally dismantle the walled garden that generates their immense profits? Something to chew on.
A necessary question for the world's most valuable company.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
Yeah.
We'll be back next time with another deep exploration into the information that matters most.